In the winter of 1934, Carl Jung sat at the long wooden table in his study at Kusnacht, the lake visible through the window as a low gray field of light. He was 59 years old. He had been writing for most of his adult life, filling notebooks and manuscript pages with the accumulated weight of his clinical observations, his theoretical arguments, his own interior experiments, and on this morning, with the pen held just above the page, he paused before writing a single word. The word was shadow. He had used it before, in passing, as a kind of shorthand for what he was beginning to understand more precisely. But on this morning, he was giving it a different kind of weight. He was not using it as a metaphor, borrowed from common speech. He was naming something, the way a naturalist names a species newly distinguished from the ones it resembles, and the act of naming, he understood, was also an act of claiming. To name the shadow was to insist that it existed, that it had structure and logic and a life of its own, and that the failure to acknowledge it was not a neutral omission, but a kind of error with consequences. That pause above the page is worth holding for a moment. Jung was not a man given to dramatic gestures, and the pause was not dramatic. It was the pause of someone who has followed a long thread of thinking, to a point where the thinking requires a word, and the word has arrived, and something in the arrival feels both right and serious. He wrote the word down, and in doing so he set in motion one of the most durable and useful frameworks that 20th century psychology would produce, not because the framework was unprecedented, not because no one had ever noticed the interior shadow before, but because Jung gave it a name and a mechanism and a place in a larger account of human development that made the shadow not merely interesting, but inescapable. Everyone, the framework insisted, has one. No act of will, no discipline of virtue, no amount of self-cultivation removes it. The shadow is not a failure of character, it is a feature of the structure. What Jung meant by the shadow, in its simplest form, was this: the conscious mind, what he called the ego, is selective. It does not carry all of a person's nature into awareness. It carries what it can manage, what it has been taught to value, what the surrounding world has indicated is acceptable and good. The rest does not disappear. It goes somewhere. And the somewhere is the unconscious, not as a metaphor for vague interiority, but as a genuine psychological structure with its own operations, its own material, and its own way of pressing against the surface of ordinary life. The shadow is the name for the part of the unconscious where the material nearest to the ego resides, the qualities and impulses and desires that the conscious self has refused, rejected, or simply never had room to acknowledge. It is not remote. It is not strange. It is, in a sense, the most intimate companion a person has, because it is made entirely of what the person already is, or was, or might have been, before the editing began. Jung was careful to distinguish two layers of the unconscious, and the distinction matters. There is the personal unconscious, the layer containing material that belongs specifically to the individual, experiences repressed or forgotten, or simply never integrated into the conscious account of the self, a sharp word spoken in anger and then smoothed over in memory, a longing held briefly and then dismissed as impractical, a quality of feeling that arrived early in childhood before there were words for it, and that was never given words, and that sank into the wordless interior. This layer is densely particular. Its contents are shaped by the specific arc of a single life, the specific family, the specific culture, the specific sequence of disappointments and permissions and prohibitions that formed a particular person out of a particular raw material. Below it, deeper and wider, lies the collective unconscious, a layer that Jung insisted was not personal at all, not the residue of individual experience, but something shared, something older, a stratum of psychological structure that precedes any individual life and persists beyond it. The collective unconscious, in Jung's account, is populated by what he called archetypes, patterns, images, and organizing principles that appear across human cultures and across historical periods in forms that are recognizably similar, despite the distances between them. The shadow is one of these archetypes. It is not only a private accumulation, it draws its peculiar weight and authority from the fact that it connects the personal refusals of a single life to the oldest and most universal of human experiences, the sense that there is more to the self than the self can see, and that what is hidden is not gone. In the quiet of the Kusnak study, with the lake outside and the manuscripts around him, Jung was working on the problem that had occupied him since his early clinical years, the problem of what happens to what is not acknowledged. He had watched it in his patients, he had watched it in himself. He had observed the pattern with enough consistency that it had ceased to seem like a collection of separate cases, and had taken on the character of a law, not a legal statute, but a law in the sense that gravity is a law, a regular and reliable feature of the way things work. What is pushed out of awareness does not become inert, it accumulates, it grows, slowly, in the way that underground water accumulates behind a dam. The pressure building not dramatically, but steadily, over years until it asserts itself through whatever gap is available. In some people, the gap is a dream, strange and insistent, carrying imagery that the daylight self cannot account for. In others, it is an emotion that arrives without warning, and in a register entirely out of proportion to the situation that seems to have produced it. A fury, a grief, a longing so acute and sourceless that it frightens the person who feels it. Jung did not think this was pathological, in the sense of being abnormal. He thought it was nearly universal. The shadow does not appear because something has gone wrong with a particular person. It appears because something has gone right with the general process of becoming a social human being, and the process has a cost. The cost is the shadow. The story of how the shadow forms begins very early. A child arrives in the world with a nature that is, in some sense, undivided, or at least less divided than it will become. The full range of what a human being can feel and want and express is present in potential from the beginning. The child can be generous and grasping, tender and furious, quiet and demanding, curious and indifferent. None of these qualities at the beginning carries a verdict. They are simply the range. But the child is not born into a vacuum. The child is born into a family, into a culture, into a specific historical moment, into a world that has already decided which qualities are acceptable and which are not. The process of socialization is, among other things, the process of receiving those verdicts. Sometimes the verdicts are delivered explicitly. A child is told that anger is shameful. The words are clear. That is not acceptable. That is not who we are in this family. That is not something we do. And the child, who needs to belong, who needs the approval and presence of the people on whom survival depends, performs the necessary operation. The anger is not expressed. It is not named. It is not examined or honored or released. It is moved. It folds quietly downward into some interior place below the reach of ordinary memory, below the level where the child can find it with the tools of conscious attention. It goes somewhere, and it waits there, with what Jung would later recognize as a characteristic patience, the patience of something that has nowhere else to be, that is in no hurry, that has all the time there is. But often the verdicts are not delivered explicitly at all. They arrive through subtler channels, through the slight withdrawal of attention when a child expresses something inconvenient, through the long patterns of what is praised and what is overlooked, through the atmosphere of a household, the unspoken agreements about who this family is, and what kind of people belong in it. A child whose sensitivity is routinely met with impatience does not necessarily receive the message in words, but the message arrives. The sensitivity is gradually moved aside, not in a single dramatic act of repression, but in a long series of small adjustments, each one barely noticeable, each one marginally reshaping the territory of what feels safe to express and what does not. By the time the child reaches adulthood, the operation is largely complete and largely invisible. The shadow is formed. It is dense with material that was not consciously chosen for exile, that was moved before the person was old enough to have a say in the matter, and the person who carries it has in most cases forgotten that the material was ever there at all. This is the peculiar quality of the shadow that Jung returned to again and again. It is not experienced as exile, it is experienced as absence. The person who was told early and often that ambition was grasping and unbecoming does not walk through life feeling the absence of ambition, the sealed room where it sits. They walk through life genuinely convinced that they are simply not an ambitious person. The quality has been so thoroughly relocated that it no longer registers as a loss. It registers only as a fact. This is who I am, and who I am does not include that. The shadow is, among other things, a record of all the self-descriptions that were written out of the autobiography. The theater of ancient Athens offers an image that helps hold this. An actor preparing to perform lifts a painted mask to his face. The mask is the word persona, the Latin term for the theatrical face, derived from a root meaning something like that, through which sound passes. The mask is not deceptive. In the context of the theater, the audience knows it is a mask. The performance proceeds with that knowledge, openly shared between the stage and the seats. But something interesting happens when the theater extends beyond the stage. When a person wears a persona, a social face constructed to meet the world's expectations of who they are and what they value and how they behave, the audience does not always know it is a mask. More importantly, the actor does not always know. The mask and the face beneath it are worn simultaneously for long enough that the distinction blurs. The performance becomes the identity, and what was set aside to make room for the performance becomes in time the forgotten interior. Jung sat with this image, the persona on one side, the shadow on the other, the ego stretched between them and trying to maintain the illusion of coherence. He understood individuation, the word he used for the long process of becoming a whole and fully realized self, as the gradual, lifelong work of bringing these parts into relationship, not eliminating the shadow, not conquering it, or subduing it, or curing it, making contact with it, developing what he called a conscious relationship with the material the ego has refused, so that the material stops pressing from below and begins instead to inform, to enrich, to add the weight of depth to a life that without it would remain, however well managed, somehow thin. Individuation is not a project with a completion date. It is not a sequence of therapeutic exercises that terminates in the achievement of wholeness. It is, in Jung's account, more like a direction than a destination, the direction of a self that is steadily becoming more aware of its own width, more honest about its own contradictions, more capable of holding what it has been carrying without knowing it was carrying anything at all. The journey, if it can be called that without importing too much of the language of destination, is made not through will, but through attention, through the willingness to look at what is there, in the interior, without the immediate need to edit or approve or categorize what is found. There is a mechanism that gives the shadow its peculiar significance in social life, and Jung gave it a name as well, Projection. The word describes something that happens automatically, below the threshold of conscious intention. When a quality has been relocated into the shadow, when it is genuinely unfindable in the conscious account of who a person is, it does not simply disappear from the person's experience. It reappears outside. It appears in other people. The quality that cannot be acknowledged internally is suddenly, vividly, inexplicably visible externally, and it carries, when it appears there, an emotional charge entirely out of proportion to what the situation would seem to warrant. A person who has banished their own tendency towards self-interest from their interior accounting discovers an intense, almost physical revulsion toward what they perceive as selfishness in others. The revulsion is real, the emotion is genuine, but its intensity draws its fuel not only from the present situation, but from the long-stored pressure of the disowned quality, pressing outward through whatever gap is available. Jung noticed this pattern in his clinical work, and then began to notice it everywhere. The ferocity with which a particular quality is condemned, in another person or in another group, often bears an interesting relationship to the condemned's own relationship with that quality. This is not a comfortable observation. It implicates nearly everyone, because nearly everyone has been through the process of socialization that creates the shadow, and nearly everyone carries qualities they cannot acknowledge, that nevertheless find their way into the world through the projected verdicts they deliver on others. The observation is not an accusation, it is a structural description of how the mechanism works. And held at that distance, as a description rather than an indictment, it opens a useful question. What is the intensity of this feeling pointing toward in the interior rather than in the world outside? On the lake outside Jung's window at Kusnacht, the light on winter mornings has a particular quality. Flat and pale and very still, the water barely moving, the far shore visible as a smudge of gray-green in the distance. It is the kind of light that does not demand attention. It simply occupies the field of vision quietly and stays. Jung looked at that light often. He was a man who found the natural world consistently useful for thinking, who built his own stone tower at Bullingen on the lake's upper shore, where he retreated to do his most interior work in conditions of deliberate simplicity, without electricity, without the press of professional life. The tower was an expression of the same instinct that animated his psychology, the instinct that the depth of a human life requires conditions in which it can be observed, that the noise of managed performance makes it difficult to hear what is actually present in the interior. He had come to his ideas about the shadow partly through his own self-examination. In the long period of interior upheaval he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. Years in the middle of his career, when he descended with remarkable deliberateness into the material that ordinary life tends to keep at bay, recording what he found in the pages of what he called the Red Book. The confrontation was not comfortable, but Jung's account of it is notable for what it is not. It is not the account of a man overwhelmed or destroyed or permanently destabilized by what he found in his own depths. It is the account of a man who went looking with enough care and preparation that the looking yielded material he could use, who found, in the interior dark, not the abyss of popular imagination, but something more like a landscape, strange in places, disorienting in places, but traversable, something that rewarded sustained and honest attention. This is what he was writing toward on that winter morning in 1934, when he paused above the page before writing the word shadow. He was writing toward a framework that would make the interior landscape legible, that would give people a vocabulary for what they were carrying. The vocabulary was not meant to be alarming. It was meant to be orienting the way a map orients, not by making the territory smaller or safer, but by making it navigable, by providing the possibility of knowing where one is within it. The shadow archetype, in Jung's final account, is not a monster. This is worth saying plainly, because the word shadow carries, in ordinary usage, a freight of unease. Jung was aware of this. He chose the word deliberately, because the shadow is genuinely the part of the self that lives in the dark of the unconscious, below the reach of the daylight ego. But darkness is not the same as danger. The dark is where things rest. The dark is where accumulation happens quietly. The dark is where potential lives before it has been called into expression. The shadow, imagined not as a threat but as a companion, has been walking behind every person for their entire life, never absent, never quite seen, present in every stumble, in every inexplicable flare of feeling, in every moment when the managed surface of a life gives way briefly to something rawer and more honest and more real. It is, in that sense, faithful. It does not leave. It does not grow impatient. It carries what the conscious self could not carry, and it carries it for as long as necessary, and it is always there when the conditions finally arise, in which the carrying can be acknowledged. The process of how a shadow is built across the span of a single childhood is, when observed closely, not dramatic. It is gradual and quiet, and shaped by 1,000 small moments, none of them individually decisive. A child discovers early what earns warmth and what earns withdrawal, and begins, not through deliberate calculation, but through the most natural of biological instincts, the instinct toward belonging, to arrange the self accordingly. What earns warmth is cultivated. What earns withdrawal is managed, which means, over time, that it is moved, not destroyed, not resolved, moved to a location below the line of ordinary consciousness, where it continues to exist in a state of suspension, unchanged by time in the way that the unconscious is characteristically resistant to the changes time makes on the surface. A child who discovers that sadness provokes discomfort in the adults she depends on does not stop being sad. She stops showing sadness. Then she stops knowing she is showing it. Then gradually she stops locating it as easily as she once did. The sadness is still there. It manifests in other ways, in a flatness that others might notice but that she herself experiences simply as how she is, in a fatigue whose source is not obvious, in a peculiar distance from moments that ought to feel moving. The sadness has been relocated rather than resolved, and the relocation has a cost that is real and ongoing, but that runs below the level where it can be easily named. Jung's insight was that this process, multiplied across all the qualities and impulses and desires that socialization requires to be managed, produces by adulthood a shadow that is not a small or marginal thing. It is, in many people, very substantial, a dense accumulation of selfhood that has been elsewhere, not lost. Jung was insistent on this, not destroyed or annihilated by the long work of socialization, but preserved, in the dark, in a state that the right kind of attention can reach. The collective dimension of the shadow, its archetypal weight, its connection to the shared inheritance of the species, gives it a quality that purely personal accounts of the unconscious cannot fully capture. When a community discovers in itself a unanimous and passionate condemnation of some quality embodied by another group, and the condemnation carries a heat and a certainty that simple moral disagreement would not seem to warrant, the Jungian framework offers an observation that is at once discomfiting and clarifying. The collective shadow operates through the same mechanism as the personal shadow. What a community cannot acknowledge in its own history, in its own nature, in its own accumulated experience, does not disappear from its experience. It reappears outside, attributed with great conviction to those who seem to embody what the community has disowned. The mechanism can be named without dwelling in its most painful illustrations. Its operation is regular enough to be called structural, and the recognition of its operation is not an invitation to moral paralysis, but an invitation to look more honestly at what the intensity of a given condemnation might be pointing toward in the interior of those who share it. In the early morning light at Kusnacht, the lake outside nearly still, Jung sets down the pen and reads back what he has written. The word shadow sits on the page with the weight he intended. He knows it will be misread, will be taken by some readers as evidence that he is drawing attention to something shameful or sinister in human nature. He is not. He is drawing attention to something structural and universal, and once understood in its structure, oddly companionable. The shadow is not evidence of moral failure. It is evidence of having been a social creature in a social world, of having been shaped by contact with others who were themselves shaped, of having internalized the long intergenerational conversation about what is acceptable and what is not. The shadow is, in this reading, one of the more honest features of a human life, because it holds without judgment the things the daylight self found too complicated to hold in the open. Jung would spend the remainder of his long career, he lived to 85, elaborating this framework, testing it against clinical material, extending it into art and myth and religion and the structures of cultural life. The shadow would remain at the center of it, not as the most dangerous or most dramatic element, but as the most intimate, the companion that no act of will could fully exile, the interior witness to the whole history of a self, the place where all the material that could not be integrated at the time was quietly and patiently stored, awaiting the conditions in which it might be received. Those conditions, in Jung's account, are not rare or difficult to produce. They require, more than anything else, a quality of attention, unhurried, non-judgmental, genuinely curious about what is there, rather than committed to a prior account of what should be there. The attention he was describing is the kind that becomes possible in stillness, in the hours when the usual management of the surface is temporarily suspended, in the half-asleep state when the distinction between the known and the carried grows temporarily more permeable, and something from the interior dark finds its way toward the dim edge of awareness. What is in the shadow is not monstrous. This is perhaps the most important thing that the framework insists on. The shadow contains everything the ego could not carry, and some of what the ego could not carry was genuinely difficult. The impulses and desires that the conscience could not accommodate, the qualities that the moral self found genuinely incompatible with its aspirations. But the shadow also contains, in most cases, a great deal that was merely inconvenient, or merely too much for the situation, or merely at odds with what a particular family or culture had decided was permissible. It contains unlived possibilities. It contains capacities that were never called on. It contains emotions that were real and valid and simply had nowhere to go. It contains, in some cases, the brightest and most vital qualities of a person, the ones that were moved aside not because they were too dark, but because they were, in some contexts, too much, too bright, too conspicuous, too exposed to the risk of disapproval. All of this waits in the dark of the psyche, not urgently, not threateningly, with the quality of something that has been placed carefully on a shelf and has not been disturbed since. The material is there. It has always been there. It will be there for as long as the conditions that would allow it to be examined are absent, and it will remain available for as long as the person carries it, which is to say, for as long as the person lives. The lake outside the window at Kusnacht is very still on winter mornings. The water holds the sky the way deep water does, absorbing the color without becoming it, keeping some quality of its own darkness in the reflection, so that what is returned to the eye is both sky and depth simultaneously. Jung looked at that water for decades. He understood it as he understood the unconscious, as something vast, largely unseen, capable of being read on its surface, but not reduced to its surface. The depth does not threaten the stillness. The stillness does not deny the depth. They coexist in the way the known self and the carried shadow coexist, one visible, one below the level of ordinary sight, both present, both real, both making up the whole of what is there. The shadow waits in the psyche with exactly that quality, quietly, without urgency, in a darkness that is not the darkness of threat, but the darkness of depth, the interior dark that every self carries beneath the bright managed surface of its ordinary life. It holds what it holds without complaint, without demand, with the patience of something that knows it is not going anywhere. And in that patient waiting, in that faithful accumulation of what the daylight self could not carry, there is something that the daylight self, when it finally turns inward with the right kind of attention, can recognize as its own. Jung encountered the word in a Latin text he had been reading in the late afternoon, when the light through the study window had gone from gold to gray, and the pages before him were lit more by lamplight than by sky. The word was persona, the mask worn by actors in the ancient theater, the clay or linen face held before the living one, so that the audience could read from a distance what the actor was performing. He set the book down and sat with the word for a while. He was a man who sat with words carefully, not moving on until they had given him what they were holding. And what this one was holding, he began to see, was something far larger than theatrical costume. It was a description of something every person did, every day, in rooms far removed from any stage. The theater at Epidaurus was built so that a whisper from the stage could reach the highest row. The masks worn by the actors were designed not for concealment, but for amplification, painted features large enough to carry expression across distance, mouths shaped to project the voice, brows fixed in sorrow or fury or comedy, so that no one in the crowd would miss the register of what was being said. The mask was a technical instrument. It served the performance, and when the performance was finished, the actor set it down and walked into the ordinary evening as himself. What Jung recognized, sitting with the Latin word in his study, was that most people do not set it down. The mask stays. The performance continues. And after enough years, the actor has so fully inhabited the role that the distance between the face beneath and the face above has become a space he no longer crosses, not because he cannot, but because he has forgotten there was ever a crossing to make. He was not the first to notice this. The theater has always known it, but Jung was among the first to place that knowledge inside a systematic account of the mind, to ask not merely whether the mask was worn, but what happened to the face behind it when it was worn for long enough, and what was gathered in the silence that grew between them. The persona, as Jung understood it, is not a deception in any simple sense. It is a necessary instrument. Life in society requires that different faces meet different situations. The face worn at the bedside of someone ill is not the face worn in a negotiation, and the face worn at a funeral is not the face worn at a celebration. These modulations are not lies. They are the ordinary grammar of social existence, the way a person moves through the various registers of a shared world without dissonance or disruption. There is nothing wrong with wearing the mask when the mask is required. The difficulty arrives when the person forgets they are wearing it, when the role becomes so thoroughly occupied that its edges cannot be felt from within, when the performance becomes the only identity the person knows how to inhabit, and the interior life, the unlived, unperformed, unapproved portion of the self, has nowhere to go but down. This is where the shadow and the persona come to be understood as twins, or perhaps as opposite ends of a single arrangement. What the persona projects outward into the social world, the competence, the composure, the acceptable emotions carefully arranged in correct proportions, the shadow receives from below. Every quality suppressed in the construction of the persona does not vanish, it travels. And what gathers in the shadow's keeping is, in a very real sense, the record of everything the performance required the self to leave behind. Irving Goffman stood in the corridors of a large university in the late 1950s and watched. He was a sociologist by training, but what he was doing in those corridors was something closer to ethnography, patient, detailed, free of the need to make what he saw fit any prior category. He watched how people adjusted as they moved through space, how a professor, alone and unhurried, walking toward his own office with papers under his arm, became almost a different arrangement of the same body when he turned a corner and encountered a colleague. The posture shifted, the expression resolved into something more deliberate. A small, almost invisible performance assembled itself in the fraction of a second between recognition and greeting. Goffman watched this happen dozens of times, in dozens of variations, and he became convinced he was watching something fundamental, not mere politeness, not mere social lubrication, but the continuous, largely unconscious labor by which the self produces itself for others and disappears into that production. What he built from those observations was a theory of social life as theater, not theater in a dismissive sense, not the suggestion that social life is false or that the people performing in it are frauds, theater in a structural sense. There is a front stage, he proposed, where the managed performance occurs, where the self is dressed and organized for encounter, where the face presented is the face selected. And there is a backstage, a region shielded from the audience, where the role can be temporarily put down, where the self that performs can rest from its performance, where something less composed and less deliberate is briefly permitted to exist. The distinction feels immediately recognizable, not as a theory, but as an experience. The backstage is the empty room entered alone after a long day. It is the kitchen before the guests arrive, when the host is still unassembled. It is the car parked in a driveway for a moment before going inside. These are not dramatic thresholds. They are the small, ordinary pauses in which the performance is between acts, and the performer is briefly, partially, returned to something prior to the role. Goffman was not judging the performance. He was mapping it with the careful neutrality of a man who found the map more interesting than the verdict. But the map, once drawn, made visible what had previously been felt without being seen, that human social life is structured around a sustained, effortful, largely invisible production of the self. What that production costs was a question Goffman's sociology named, but did not fully enter. It remained for others working in adjacent territory to follow the cost further inward. Jean-Paul Sartre served as a prisoner of war in Germany during 1940 and 1941, and what the experience gave him, among other things, was a concentrated study of the way human beings inhabit roles. He watched the guards perform their authority. He watched the prisoners perform their submission. He watched with a philosopher's precision the way the performance on both sides was held in place, not only by power, but by something more interior, by the habit of making the role identical with the self. of accepting the definition offered by the situation and installing it so thoroughly that the interior distance between who one was and what one was required to do became invisible or ceased to feel available. He had a name for this, not a polite name. Bad faith. The French was mauvaise foi, which carries in it something slightly more visceral than the English translation conveys. The condition he was describing was not simply a failure of honesty directed at other people. It was a failure of honesty directed at oneself, a refusal of the freedom that he believed was constitutive of human existence, replaced by the comfortable pretense that one was simply what one's role required, that choice was never available, that the performance and the performer were one and indistinguishable. He wrote about a waiter in a Paris cafe, not as an attack on waiters or on those who wait tables. As a philosophical illustration, the waiter he described moved through his work with a total conviction, the tray held just so, the step precise and practiced, the formality of the service so completely inhabited that the man inside it had ceased to be visible. And Sartre looked at this and saw something philosophically interesting. Not fraudulence, not deception of the customers, but a kind of self-forgetting, the most fundamental kind, the forgetting that the role and the person inhabiting the role were not the same thing, that the waiter was a consciousness who had chosen to wait tables this morning and could in principle have chosen otherwise, and that below the practiced formality of the performance was a freedom that the performance was organized to make unavailable, even to its own subject. Bad faith was not, for Sartre, a moral failing in any ordinary sense. He was not lecturing, he was identifying a condition that arose from the difficulty of freedom itself, the fact that being free, genuinely and continuously free, is uncomfortable in a way that most people are not equipped or inclined to sustain. The role is easier. The role tells you what to do, what to be, what to feel, what to value, who to present yourself as, and to whom. The role is, in its way, a relief, and the cost of that relief is the perpetual slight dimming of the consciousness that accepted the role as the whole story. The person who most deeply inhabits a persona, Jung would have recognized, is paying this cost, not in any moment of dramatic reckoning, but in the slow, accumulating way that all sustained performance extracts its fee. Something is spent in the maintenance of the mask. Something is left unclaimed in the space the performance cannot enter, and that unclaimed portion does not dissolve. It waits. It takes on weight. What clinical and social inquiry has found, across many different methods and many different populations, is that the cost is not primarily social, but internal. The difficulty of a large gap between the self that is performed and the self that is privately known is not mainly the difficulty of being caught, of the performance failing, of the mask slipping. It is the difficulty of the distance itself. When what a person presents to the world and what a person privately contains have moved far enough apart, the bridge between them becomes hard to locate. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was so rarely traveled that the way across grew unfamiliar. And without the bridge, certain things that human beings require for their full functioning become difficult to reach. The capacity for genuine intimacy, which depends on allowing oneself to be seen in something other than the managed presentation. The capacity for genuine rest, which depends on having some interior space where the performance is not ongoing, and something that might simply be called being known, which requires that the one being known is present in the encounter and not substituted by the role. A person can arrive after years of careful performance at a condition where the persona has been maintained with such discipline and such success that it has colonized even the private hours, where the backstage that Goffman described has been compressed to almost nothing, and the time not spent performing is spent recovering from performance in preparation for the next one. This is not a moral condition. It is not a verdict on anyone. It is a description of what happens at the far end of a process that begins quite reasonably, quite understandably, in the ordinary and necessary adjustments of social life. The persona is built for reasons. It is not an accident. From very early in life, the social world instructs the developing self about which portions of its natural expression will be received well and which will not. The instruction is not usually explicit. It arrives through the quality of attention given or withheld, through the warmth in a parent's face when certain things are said, and the cooling when other things are said, through the small social calibrations of the schoolroom, the playground, the dinner table, the continuous and cumulative education in what the world will accommodate and what it will return, unmarked or mark with disapproval. Out of this education, the child assembles a face for the world, a self-presentation refined through feedback, adjusted through experience, built up over time into something that functions as protection and as tool and as social instrument all at once. The mask works. That is what must be said clearly. The persona is not a mistake. It is an achievement. The capacity to modulate self-presentation, to meet different situations with different registers of the self, to hold back in one context what would be appropriate in another. This is not self-betrayal. It is social intelligence. The philosophical problem is not with modulation. It is with forgetting that modulation is occurring. It is with the closing of the gap between the one who performs and the performance until the space that once existed between them, the space where the genuine unperformed self once lived and moved, can no longer be found. Jung had a particular interest in what happened to people in the middle of their lives, not the young person still in the process of construction, still assembling identity, still finding out what worked and what didn't in the social world, but the person who had built the persona successfully and now lived inside it with a kind of completeness that ought to feel like satisfaction and somehow did not. He noticed that people who arrived at this point, successful by social measure, capable and composed, having inhabited their role with skill and dedication, often reported a quiet and puzzling dissatisfaction. Not dramatic suffering, not the acute distress of crisis or loss, something more like a low, persistent note beneath the ordinary music of their days. A sense that something was present that was not being met, or that something was missing from the arrangement that could not immediately be identified. He understood this, in part, as the shadow's way of making itself known, not through catastrophe, usually, but through this quality of quiet insistence, the recurring dream that does not fit the waking identity, the inexplicable intensity of feeling that seems out of proportion to its occasion, the sudden and surprising response to art or music or a stranger's face, the persistent pull toward a life that has never been lived. These were not symptoms of malfunction in the ordinary sense. They were, as he read them, communications from the portion of the self that the persona had required to remain silent, returning not with rage, but with the patient, continued presence of something that had been waiting a long time and had learned to wait. There is a particular quality to the silence that accumulates on the other side of sustained performance. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of something full, full of what was never said, never expressed, never permitted to arrive at the surface where it might have been received and recognized. The shadow holds what the persona has no room for, and the weight of that holding is felt, eventually, even by those who have never given the arrangement A single deliberate thought felt as flatness, as the slight inability to locate what one actually wants, now that the question is asked directly, as the strange unfamiliarity of one's own face in an unguarded moment, when the mirror catches something the persona did not arrange. Goffman would have understood this in sociological terms: the backstage too small, the performance too continuous, the role too completely inhabited. Sartre would have understood it in existential terms: the freedom that belongs to consciousness having been surrendered so thoroughly to the role that it cannot easily be found again. Jung understood it as something else as well, as a loss of contact with the larger, less arranged, less socially acceptable self that had always been there beneath the surface of the performance, carrying portions of the full human inheritance that the persona had been built to keep out of sight. And what all three were pointing toward, from their different positions and their different languages, was the same recognition that the mask and the face are not identical, and that the effort required to sustain the pretense that they are extracts something that cannot be indefinitely afforded without loss. Not the immediate dramatic loss of breakdown or crisis, but the slow incremental loss of access to oneself, the gradual dimming of the interior signal that tells a person what they feel, what they want, what they actually think beneath the thought that the role provides ready-made. A woman sits in a quiet room with a person she has known for many years, not a professional encounter, but a friendship of long standing, one of the relationships in which the ordinary protections ought, by now, to have been lowered. The other person asks her what she wants, in the simple sense, not what she wants from the world, not from her work, but what she wants in some ordinary and immediate way from the afternoon. And she finds, with a surprise that she cannot quite account for, that the question does not have an answer available to her. She has been excellent at knowing what is required. She has been meticulous and successful at meeting requirements, at shaping herself to the shape of what each situation demanded. But the question of what she wants, posed without context, without role, without the structure of a situation that prescribes the appropriate response, arrives and finds no clear answer waiting. This is not stupidity. It is not personal failure. It is what happens when the persona has been the primary mode of self-experience for long enough that the self beneath the persona has grown quiet in its own presence, accustomed to being addressed only in its managed form. The genuine answer is there. It has always been there, patient and unextinguished, in the interior place where things are kept, not because they are shameful, but simply because the surface of life has had no sustained room for them. The question is a small opening, and something in the room, something in the quality of the friendship, the quality of the asking, is large enough to let a real answer begin to form. Sartre would say that in that moment, the freedom that was always present is briefly felt as available, the freedom to step back from the role and notice who is wearing it. Jung would say that the self's shadow is briefly near the surface, close enough that the light from the ordinary room might just be sufficient to make out its shape. Goffman, with his careful sociological gaze, might simply say that the backstage has expanded, just for a moment, into territory usually held by the front, and that in the expansion something is possible that the performance normally prevents. The mask is never wrong to have been worn. This is the important thing to hold. The persona is not evidence of cowardice or self-betrayal. It is evidence of how thoroughly social life shapes the beings who live inside it, of how genuinely the developing self learns from its environment what is safe to be. There is a kind of intelligence in the learning, and there is a kind of cost in the thoroughness with which the lesson was internalized, in the precision with which the performance was constructed and maintained. What costs is not the wearing of the mask, but the losing of the awareness that the mask is on, the slow completion of the merger between performer and performance, until the space where the difference lived has been so thoroughly absorbed that the question of what the face beneath the mask looks like has ceased to feel as though it is a question at all. Yunu continued working at his desk in Kusnacht through the long years of his middle life and into his old age. He was not a man who simplified the things he was thinking about, or who allowed his own professional persona, the doctor, the scientist, the founder of a school, to entirely crowd out the questions he was living with, rather than merely studying. He kept a second building on his property at Bollingen, a stone tower he built with his own hands, and continued adding to over the decades, without electricity, without telephone, without the ordinary instruments of modern professional life. He went there to write and to think, and perhaps to exist for a while in a register of himself that the professional role did not reach. Whether he understood this as shadow work in any formal sense is uncertain, but the gesture is suggestive, the deliberate maintenance of a space where the performance was not required, where the face that the world knew could be briefly set down. He never argued that the persona should be abandoned. He argued only that it should be seen for what it is, a necessary and useful instrument, not the whole person, not the final truth of the self, but the shape the self takes when it goes out to meet the world. The difference between wearing the mask and forgetting it is not the difference between social competence and social failure. It is the difference between a life in which the interior self is known to the person living it, and a life in which the interior self has grown somewhat unfamiliar, somewhat distant, somewhat harder to reach than it once was. The distance is not permanent. It is not the sentence of anyone who has spent years performing successfully. It is simply the natural consequence of sustained attention directed outward, toward the requirements, the expectations, the carefully maintained surface of the social self, without equivalent attention directed inward, toward the unperformed, unmanaged, uncertified portion of the self that continues quietly to exist. To become aware of wearing the mask is not to remove it. It is to recover the sense that there is a face beneath it, that the persona and the person are not identical, that the role and the consciousness inhabiting the role retain a distinction that can be felt, if the interior climate is quiet enough for the feeling to arrive. Jung spent the better part of his professional life arguing that this recovery was not merely possible, but necessary, not as a program or a project, but as an ongoing, imperfect, entirely ordinary relationship with the parts of oneself that the performance has required to wait. The performance will resume, the mask will be lifted again when the situation requires it. But in the pauses between performances, in the quiet room, in the car before going inside, in the moment between waking and the first assembling of the day's required face, the awareness can be present, briefly and without urgency, that the mask is a mask and the face beneath it is still there, still intact, neither lost nor changed, beyond recognition, simply waiting with the particular patience of things that have nowhere else to go, and have learned over a long time that patience is enough, that awareness asks nothing. It requires no action, no reckoning, no deliberate program of self-examination. It is simply the quality of a small and interior recognition that the person performing is not identical with the performance, that the self exceeds the role, that beyond the careful surface of the managed presentation, there is a wider interior in which things have been stored and kept, not as enemies or burdens, but as the accumulated depth of everything that the surface could not hold. In the pause before the mask is lifted again, that width is briefly present. It does not demand to be entered. It asks only to be known to be there, and knowing it is there, the person who has been performing all day is very slightly more complete than the performance alone could make them. The quiet is enough. The awareness is enough. The brief, unguarded moment between one performance and the next holds in its stillness the full measure of what the mask was built to protect. John Bradshaw stood at the front of a conference room in the mid 1980s, somewhere in the American South, in a building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, and the particular smell of coffee kept warm too long. The people assembled there had come for reasons they may not have been entirely able to name. Some of them had driven long distances. He picked up a marker and turned toward the whiteboard, and in careful block letters he wrote 2 words, toxic shame. He set the marker down and turned back to the room, and for a moment no one spoke. Not because the words were unfamiliar, because they were too familiar. Because in the pause that followed their appearance on the white surface, something in the room recognized itself. That recognition, quiet, involuntary, arriving before any argument had been made, is itself the first and most important thing to understand about shame. It does not wait to be introduced. It is already present. It has been present in most lives for a very long time, settled so deeply into the architecture of the interior that it no longer announces itself as shame at all. It simply becomes the texture of how a person holds their own presence in the world. Bradshaw spent years in his clinical work and his writing drawing a distinction that seems small but opens onto something vast. There is shame that functions as a signal, he said. There is the brief flush of recognition when something genuinely wrong has been done, a promise broken, a cruelty committed, a moment of selfishness that cost another person something real. That quality of shame is not comfortable, but it is purposeful. It points toward repair. It is shame in service of the moral life, arriving with information and departing once the information has been received and something has been done with it. Then there is something else entirely, something that has uncoupled itself from any specific action or transgression and has settled instead into the structure of the self. Not the feeling that a thing was done badly, but the conviction, wordless, pervasive, and very old, that the one who did it is bad in some permanent and foundational way. Bradshaw called this toxic shame, and what made the room go still when he wrote those 2 words was not that they named something new, but that they separated 2 things that had been running together for so long that the distinction had been forgotten. A feeling that arrives when something is genuinely wrong can be lived with. A verdict about the nature of the person can only be hidden, and so hiding begins. It begins early. It begins in the small encounters of childhood, in which the world, or some representative of the world, communicates that some portion of the self, as it naturally presents itself, is not welcome. This does not require cruelty. It does not require intention. A child is loud in a way that embarrasses, and the embarrassment is communicated in a look, and the child does not register the thought behind the look, but registers the quality of it, the contraction, the turning away, the lowered temperature of the room. The loudness does not go away. The impulse behind the loudness does not go away. What goes away, gradually and with increasing permanence, is the child's willingness to let that impulse arrive in public. It learns the room. It learns which portions of itself make the room warm and which make it cold, and it begins curating accordingly, placing the difficult materials somewhere less visible, somewhere the temperature will not change on their account. By adulthood, the curation is so habitual that it has become invisible. The person no longer experiences themselves as having learned to conceal certain things. They experience themselves as simply not being those things. The anger that was shamed in childhood does not register as anger being held back. It registers as not being an angry person. The need for comfort that was labeled as too much does not register as comfort being denied. It registers as not being the kind of person who needs comfort. The distinction has been erased. What began as something put away has become, over enough years, something apparently absent, and the forgetting of the concealment is itself what the psyche means by repression. Sigmund Freud had been listening in his Vienna consulting room for years before he developed the language to describe what he was hearing. Patient after patient arrived, carrying something they could not see. They came with symptoms, anxieties, compulsions, bodily troubles for which no physical cause could be located, the peculiar slippages of speech and memory that he would later call parapraxis. And in all of these he heard not random noise, but a kind of insistence. Something was pressing upward from below. Something was finding ways to appear that could not be sealed off entirely, because what the psyche excludes from one door, it tends to push toward another. Repression, as Freud understood it, is not forgetting. Forgetting is passive. Repression is active, a continuous, effortful process of exclusion by which the psyche keeps certain materials below the threshold of conscious awareness. The effort is invisible to the person doing it, which is what makes it a defense rather than a decision. No one decides to repress. The mechanism operates beneath the level where decisions are made, at a depth where something has been assessed, too painful, too threatening, too incompatible with the self's acceptable image, and a kind of interior door closes. Not once, finally, but again and again, every time the excluded material moves toward the surface. What Freud noticed was that the excluded material did not become quiet. It became insistent in proportion to the force applied to keep it down. It returned in the imagery of dreams, whose logic is not the logic of the waking mind, and whose gates are not managed by the same mechanisms of exclusion. It returned in the slipped word, the inexplicable aversion, the disproportionate response to a situation that should not carry that weight. It returned in symptoms that could not be explained, but that examined carefully over the long hours of analytic work turned out to be meaningful, the body or the behavior giving form to something the conscious mind had refused to hold. This is not a clinical observation in the narrow sense. It is an observation about the nature of buried material, the simple fact that what is placed below does not remain inert. It continues. It has its own life in the dark of the interior, and the effort required to keep it there, the sustained energy of not knowing, is not free. It costs something. It costs a certain aliveness, a certain range of motion in the interior life, a certain capacity for the full spectrum of feeling. The person who has never permitted themselves to be seen in grief may find, decades later, that something in the architecture of feeling has stiffened, not because grief is gone, but because the refusal of grief, maintained over many years, has become a posture so fixed it no longer recognizes itself as a posture. One of the things that Freud understood, and that the tradition following him has explored in many directions, is that repressed material does not arrive in its original form when it returns. It arrives in disguise. It arrives wearing the shape of something else, a preoccupation, a pattern of behavior, a recurring quality of feeling that the person experiences as their own without recognizing it as the disguised return of something old. This is part of what makes the interior geography so difficult to read without sustained attention. The map has been altered. The material that needed concealing has over time been given a new form, a new address, a new set of apparent causes, so that looking at the surface, even carefully, does not reveal where the original material is housed. The specific contents of what gets buried are not the same for everyone. They vary, and the variation is not random. It follows the logic of what a given culture, in a given historical moment, has decided it is acceptable for a given kind of person to be. What one tradition represses another may receive without discomfort. A quality of expressiveness that earns warmth in one household brings disapproval in another. An intellectual seriousness that is celebrated in some environments becomes, in others, a form of social liability, and the child who carries it learns early to put it away in certain rooms. The ambition that is praised in some is called arrogance in others, and the one who has been called arrogant early enough will spend years convinced that what they feel when they want something large is a failing rather than a capacity. This means that the path to understanding what a given person has placed in their shadow is not a universal path. It does not follow a single map. It requires something more particular, a willingness to look not only at the individual interior, but at the values and prohibitions that were installed there, the specific cultural agreements that determined, before the person had any say in the matter, which portions of their natural expression were acceptable and which were not. Shadow work, in this sense, is always also an encounter with the world that shaped the shadow, with the particular version of acceptability that was delivered to a developing self before it had the tools to examine whether that version was true or useful or worth the cost of its enforcement. Brené Brown spent a decade in research before she arrived at what she has described as the finding she most resisted, that the solution to shame is not stronger armor, not more carefully maintained self-presentation, not the refinement of the hiding. She had expected the research to point toward competence, toward strategies, toward the productive management of vulnerability. What it pointed toward instead was the willingness to be seen, not in the sense of performance, not in the sense of exhibition, but in the particular and precise sense of allowing another person to witness the interior in its actual state, including the portions that feel uncertain and unclaimed and not ready for display. Shame thrives in the absence of that witnessing. This is its ecology. It requires the sealed interior, the maintained distance, the conviction that certain portions of the self must remain invisible, or the entire edifice will be endangered. When material that has been held in shame is named, not performed, not dressed for company, but actually named, in the quiet presence of someone who has not retreated from the naming, something shifts. The weight of the sealed thing is not in the thing itself, it is in the sealing, it is in the sustained effort of concealment, and in the solitude that concealment creates. Shame is, among other things, a profound aloneness, the experience of inhabiting a self that cannot be fully shared, that must maintain a certain permanent distance from genuine contact, because genuine contact is precisely the risk that shame refuses. The warmth of another person's attention, offered without the expectation of performance, without the requirement that what is shared be acceptable or admirable, does something to shame that no amount of solitary analysis can do. It provides the climate in which the sealed material can be held without being condemned. It offers, for the duration of the honest exchange, the alternative verdict, not defective, but human, not permanently marked, but carrying something that nearly everyone carries in some form, and that nearly everyone has been too isolated in their carrying to know that they are not alone in it. Jung located the shame-laden material in the shadow, the accumulation in the unconscious of all that the conscious self has found unacceptable, inadmissible, too much, or not enough. But he made a point that is easy to pass over quickly and deserves to be held a little longer. The shadow does not contain only what is morally problematic. It does not hold only the anger and the greed and the cruelty that the civilized self prefers not to claim. It holds equally what is too beautiful, too large, too gifted to be admitted without disturbing the manageable self image that social life requires. There is a quality of shame that attaches not to what is base, but to what is grand. A child who draws with unusual imagination may be told, with the particular coldness of a deflating remark, that this is showing off. A teenager whose thinking is genuinely original may be taught by the social temperature of the room that intelligence of a certain kind is a social inconvenience. A young person with an unusual capacity for tenderness learns in certain environments that the tenderness is weakness and files it accordingly in the place where weakness goes. By the time this person reaches adulthood, the capacity for tenderness has not disappeared, but it has become, in the economy of the interior, something whose price was too high to pay openly, and it waits behind the door with the patience that all buried things develop over years of patient waiting. This material, the golden portion of the shadow, in Jungian language, can lie there for a lifetime. The person moves through the world with a persistent, low-grade sense that something essential is absent from their life, not knowing that what is absent has not gone anywhere, but is simply behind a door whose handle they learned not to reach for. The longing for something unlived may present itself as restlessness, as a vague dissatisfaction that does not attach to any particular circumstance, and therefore cannot be addressed by changing the circumstances, as the recurring feeling that the life being lived, however objectively successful, is not quite the life that belongs to them. James Hollis has spent decades in the practice of depth psychology, attending to exactly this quality of restlessness. He has described it as meaningful, not as a symptom of deficiency, but as a message arriving from below the threshold of conscious intention, asking a question that the conscious mind has been too busy or too afraid to ask honestly. The question is something like, what portion of what is actually present in this person has not yet been given room to live? It is not a comfortable question. It unsettles the arrangements that have been made. But it is not, Hollis insists, an enemy. It is a form of care extended by the deeper self toward the life being half-lived in its name. In the early years of the 20th century, in the consulting rooms of Central Europe, a way of listening was being developed that had not existed in quite that form before. Not listening for the solution, not listening toward the resolution of the difficulty, listening instead for the shape of what was present, attending to the strange imagery of the dream, the recurring emotional signature of the symptom, the quality of feeling that attached to apparently unrelated things, with the specific patience of someone who has decided to take seriously the possibility that none of this is meaningless, that the interior, even in its most oblique and disguised communications, is saying something. Freud had opened this way of listening. What he heard there had startled him at the beginning by its range, the intensity of the repressed material, the force with which it pressed toward the surface, the directness with which it spoke in the language of symbol and substitution in the imagery of dreams. He had expected, perhaps, to find in the unconscious only the traces of specific traumas, specific overwhelming experiences. What he found was an interior architecture more extensive than that. A whole stratum of excluded material, organized around the logic not of the event, but of the prohibition. The material was there not only because something had happened, but because something had been made inadmissible, because the interior, early and without consent, had been given a geography of acceptable and unacceptable, and had been sorting itself into those categories ever since. A woman sits in her late 30s in a city she has lived in for a decade, in a position she has held for several years, in a life that has by most available measures worked out. She is not unhappy in any acute sense, but in the hour before sleep, in the particular stillness of a room that has gone dark, while the rest of the city continues its noise, she notices something she does not have a name for, a quality of wistfulness, of something slightly out of reach, of a door that is somewhere in the interior of the building, and that she has walked past many times without opening. She does not know what is behind it. She may not even know in the morning that she noticed the door. The noticing happens in the half country between waking and sleep, in the hours when the persona has been set aside and the managed self is no longer entirely in command of what arrives. That threshold, the space between the day's performance and the night's release, is one of the places where the shadow's presence can most easily be felt. Not because the shadow is more active at night, but because the ordinary mechanisms of avoidance are briefly less active. The busyness that organizes the day and keeps the interior questions at a productive distance has quieted. The social performance has been suspended, and in the absence of that constant maintenance, something that has been waiting with great patience becomes briefly detectable, not loud, not urgent. It has learned, over years of being met with the closed door, not to be loud. It has learned the long rhythms of patience, the measured communication of the persistent rather than the insistent. The patience of what has been buried is one of its most characteristic qualities. It does not require immediate attention. It does not collapse if the attention is not given tonight, or next week, or next year. It is not going anywhere. It arrived in the psyche because it belongs there, because it is part of the actual composition of this person, and composition does not dissolve simply because it has been deemed unacceptable. It waits. It waits with the steadiness of something that knows itself to be essential, even when the person who carries it has decided for reasons that made sense at the time that it cannot be let in. The philosopher's insight and the psychologist's clinical observation converge on a single point here. What is excluded from the life does not become absent from the self. It becomes present in a different register, in the shape of what is avoided, in the pull of what is disproportionately condemned in others, in the texture of the unlived, in the quality of the nights when the management temporarily fails, and something that has been held back briefly comes forward into the quiet. Bradshaw's whiteboard with its 2 words was doing something specific. It was not explaining shame to people who had not experienced it. It was offering a distinction to people who had been living inside the experience without being able to see its edges. The difference between a feeling that arrives with information and a feeling that has become a verdict about the fundamental nature of the person is the difference between something that can be engaged and something that can only be maintained in concealment. When the distinction becomes available, when the experience can be named and its edges found, the concealment begins to lose some of its necessity. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the architecture of the sealed interior is built in part on the conviction that the sealed material cannot be looked at directly without catastrophe, and looking at it directly and finding that the catastrophe does not arrive is already a different kind of knowing. The research Brené Brown conducted across many years arrived at findings she has described as counterintuitive to everything she had assumed about strength. She had entered the work expecting that what distinguished people who lived with a sense of connection and wholeness from those who did not would be some quality of competence or resilience or carefully managed presentation. What she found was the willingness to be imperfect in the presence of another person, not the performance of imperfection, which is its own kind of armor, but the actual risk of being seen before the management is complete, in the state of genuine uncertainty and genuine need and genuine not knowing, the state that shame most urgently insists must be hidden. There is a particular quality to an exchange in which one person has taken this risk and the other person has not moved away. Something in the room changes. Something in the person who took the risk changes too. The change is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is more like a slow restoration of atmospheric pressure, as though the sustained effort of concealment had been pressing outward on the walls of the interior, and the walls had briefly been allowed to return to their natural state. The relief of being known is not the relief of having performed well, it is the relief of not having to perform at all, for the duration of this moment, with this person, in this particular quality of unhurried attention. The Jungian framework would say that what has been encountered in that moment is the beginning of a different relationship to the shadow, not the elimination of the shadow, not the dragging of everything concealed into the harsh light of permanent exposure, but the quiet extension of a different kind of attention toward what has been held in the sealed interior, attention that is curious rather than judgmental, patient rather than urgent, willing to receive rather than insisting on correction. The shadow is large. It has been filling for a lifetime. It contains the anger that was shamed in the 3rd year of life and has been waiting since then for a welcome it was not given. It contains the need for comfort that was labeled excessive and filed accordingly. It contains the ambition that was called arrogance, and the tenderness that was called weakness, and the strangeness that was called too much, and the quietness that was called not enough. It contains also the creative gifts that were deemed impractical, the emotional knowing that was dismissed as sentiment, the questions that were discouraged because they made the adults in the room uncomfortable. All of this has been carefully placed over the decades in an interior room whose door has been kept closed, not out of malice, but out of the only available response to what the world communicated about what was admissible. The room is not a dungeon. This is perhaps the most important thing to know about it. It is not a place of punishment. It is a place of storage, patient, organized, occupied by things that are waiting not for exile, but for a different quality of welcome. The contents are not enemies. They are, in a very precise sense, the parts of the self that did not have anywhere else to go, that were too alive to dissolve and too inadmissible to remain in the open, and so they went to the only available interior address, and they set up their quiet residence, and they have been waiting there with the patience that only very old and very essential things know how to sustain. Freud listened to what returned from behind the door, and found that it returned carrying meaning. Jung listened and found that it returned carrying not only what was problematic, but what was whole, that the shadow held, along with everything the civilized self had refused, the seeds of a fuller and more honest life. Bradshaw listened and found that the shame which had sealed the door was itself the primary wound, more encompassing than any of the specific contents it had placed inside. Brown listened and found that the healing that was possible in that sealed interior was not a solitary project, but a relational one, that it required not only a willing interior, but a willing witness. None of these observations agree entirely. They arrive from different disciplines, different traditions, different questions, and they have different emphases, but they converge on the same neighborhood, and the neighborhood is this, that what has been placed below, placed aside, placed in the dark of the interior, whether it arrived there through the mechanism Freud described, or the socialization Jung traced, or the shame Bradshaw named, or the loneliness Brown documented, has not ceased to be present. It has only ceased to be acknowledged. An acknowledgement, offered quietly and without the requirement that everything be fixed at once, or fixed tonight, or fixed at all, is already a form of change. The room in the interior does not need to be emptied tonight. The door does not need to be thrown open. The contents have been stored with care, and the care can be matched. A single moment of quiet recognition, the acknowledgement that the room exists, that it is occupied, that what is inside has been there a long time and has waited with great patience, is already something. It is already a different posture toward the self than the one that required the door to remain permanently sealed. It is already the beginning of a different kind of company. The child who was told that her need for comfort was too much is still in some form present in the adult who learned that lesson. The need did not go away. The room where the need was placed is still warm. It has always been warm because that is the nature of what was placed inside it. It was alive, and alive things hold their warmth, even in the dark, even across the long years of patient waiting. The warmth is not dangerous. It is not demanding. It has only been there, occupying its careful portion of the interior, holding on behalf of the person who placed it there, a quality of feeling that the world was not yet ready to receive. The act of quiet attention, not analysis, not correction, not the urgent project of transformation, is already a form of welcome, and what has been waiting in that warm interior room on its carefully arranged shelves has been waiting for exactly this. Not for the door to be taken off its hinges, not for the whole building to be rebuilt, only for the quality of attention that says, what is here has not been forgotten. What is here is real. What is here has been patient, and the patience is known, and the patience is met now with something like stillness, and something like care, and something like the long, unhurried willingness to simply remain. Plato settled at his work in the early morning, some years after the death of Socrates, in the room at the academy where he had come to think of the long wooden table and the particular quality of the Mediterranean light as inseparable from the act of thinking itself. The day was not yet warm. The courtyard outside was quiet. He had been writing for some years by then, writing, in a sense, against the silence that Socrates had left behind, attempting to give permanent form to arguments that had previously lived only in conversation and in the memory of the men who had been present. On this particular morning, he was working on what would eventually be called the Republic *, and the problem before him was one he could not resolve by looking away from it. If a person sincerely wishes to be good, why does that wish so rarely produce goodness without enormous effort, and why does it sometimes fail to produce it at all? The answer he had arrived at was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. He had been thinking for long enough that intellectual comfort had come to seem like a symptom of insufficient attention rather than a sign of understanding genuinely achieved. The soul, he wrote, was not a single thing. It was three things held in uneasy proximity: the part that reasons, the part that strives and feels what might be called spirit, and the part that hungers, that desires without patience and without a great deal of interest in the rational case for delay. He gave names to these three. He thought about their arrangement, and in naming the appetitive part of the soul, in taking it seriously as a permanent feature of the inner life rather than a temporary failure of will, he was doing something that philosophy had not done so plainly before, acknowledging that the desire to be virtuous and the capacity for virtue are not the same thing, and that in most human beings they are not even close neighbors. That acknowledgement carries a weight that does not diminish with time. The person who genuinely wants to be patient and finds anger rising anyway. The person who values honesty and discovers a small self-serving story forming before they have noticed it forming. The person who aspires to generosity and feels with some shame the contraction of the self when the cost of generosity becomes real. Plato had looked at these experiences and refused to explain them away. They are not failures of intention, he was suggesting. They are the structure of what a soul is, multiple, internally divided, and never entirely at peace with itself. This was not a verdict against human nature, so much as a description of it, offered with the particular clarity of a man who had been watching human nature long enough to stop being surprised by what it contained. The soul Plato described was a household in which the residents do not always agree. Reason sets the direction, or tries to. The spirited part provides the energy, the drive, the ambition, the capacity for righteous resistance that gives moral effort its force. But the appetitive part does not consult the others. It wants what it wants when it wants it, and the discipline required to bring it into any kind of working arrangement with reason is the labor of a lifetime, rather than the achievement of a single resolved moment. The philosopher king of asterisk. The Republic asterisk is not free from this arrangement. He is distinguished only by how seriously he takes it, and how much of his life he devotes to the difficult ongoing work of bringing the household into something like order. The order, Plato was honest enough to suggest, is never final. It is renewed, or it is lost, and then renewed again from whatever ground remains. What Plato was mapping in philosophical prose is a territory that would take many centuries and many different kinds of attention to fully understand. He did not have the vocabulary of the unconscious. He did not know that the parts of the soul he was describing would eventually be discussed in terms of what lies below the reach of ordinary awareness. He was working with the tools available to him, with close observation of human behavior, with the rigor of argument, and with the honesty of a man who had decided that philosophy was worth very little if it required him to look away from anything true. What he found, by looking honestly, was that the inner life is constituted by a kind of ongoing negotiation between parts that do not share the same aspirations, and that the negotiation is never finished. This is not a pessimistic conclusion, it is a realistic one, and realism in philosophy is often the beginning of something that eventually becomes a different kind of peace. Friedrich Nietzsche walked in the mornings. In the summers he spent in Sils Maria, in the Swiss Alps. He would rise early and take to the mountain paths above the village before the light had fully settled, moving at what people who encountered him described as a remarkable pace for a man so frequently ill, his head often bowed, his hands clasped loosely behind him, his whole posture suggesting a man conducting an argument with someone not externally present. The altitude suited him, he said, because it made thinking feel necessary rather than optional. He wrote some of his most considered work in those mountain mornings, in notebooks he carried in his coat, pausing on the path to set something down before the phrasing dissolved. By the time he was writing asterisk Beyond Good and Evil asterisk in the mid-1880s, he had been living with a set of questions about morality that he could not resolve without going considerably further than anyone before him had been willing to go. The question was not whether conventional morality was sometimes wrong in its specific judgments. Most serious thinkers had been willing to grant that. The question Nietzsche was turning over on those mountain paths was structural, whether the very framework of Western moral thought, the framework that set virtue against passion and reason against instinct, had produced something it congratulated itself on without examining what had been sacrificed in the process, what had been suppressed in the name of the good, what force had been quietly drained from human life in the service of an ideal that was not, on close inspection, as noble as it appeared. The case he was building was not a case for the abandonment of all values. That reading of Nietzsche is a comfortable misreading. He was not arguing that nothing matters. He was arguing something more specific and more interesting, that the suppression of what conventional morality called the lower impulses, aggression, ambition, the will to impose a shape on the world, had not produced genuine virtue, but had produced something smaller and more resentful than virtue. The man who has been told that his power is shameful does not become a saint by accepting the prohibition. He becomes, in Nietzsche's reading, someone who has simply redirected that power inward, disguising it as moral superiority, while quietly condemning everyone who still expresses what he himself has learned to hide. The shadow, Nietzsche was suggesting, though he did not use that word, is not merely what has been suppressed. It is what the suppression has done to the person who agreed to suppress it. He was particularly suspicious of what he called the herd morality, the moral framework that achieves its stability by requiring that everyone reduce themselves to a common denominator, that no one reaches too high or desires too specifically or exercises a will that disturbs the comfortable arrangement of the group. This kind of morality did not make people good, in his view. It made them manageable, and the cost borne quietly by the individuals who complied was precisely the material that ends up in the shadow, the unlived ambition, the suppressed particularity, the desire to make something of genuine shape and difficulty rather than something merely acceptable. He sat with this idea until it had clarified, and then he wrote it down with the precision of a man who had learned that precision was the only form of courtesy available to a hard truth. There is something in Nietzsche's account that recognizes what is later called the golden shadow, the possibility that what has been refused is not only dangerous but luminous, not only transgressive but alive. The qualities that a culture condemns as excessive or threatening are sometimes qualities that the culture has simply not found a way to hold without feeling threatened by them. Greatness makes the ordinary uncomfortable. Genuine passion makes measured contentment look like a choice that was made before the alternatives were considered. Nietzsche was not celebrating cruelty or carelessness. He was noticing that between cruelty and genuine vitality, there is a great deal of territory that conventional morality has failed to map, and that in the attempt to prohibit the cruelty, it has frequently prohibited the vitality along with it, leaving the shadow dense with everything that was refused in the name of the prohibitable. Robert Louis Stevenson was writing in Bournemouth in 1885, confined by illness to a room that had become familiar in the way that rooms become familiar when a person has spent too long in them, every angle known, every quality of light known, the particular sound of the house at night, known in the way that only sustained proximity produces. He was not well. He was often not well during these years, and the physical constraint had a way of concentrating the imagination, pressing it into shapes it might not have found in conditions of more ordinary ease. He had been thinking about something. He had been thinking about it for some time, in the way that writers sometimes carry a problem without yet knowing what they are carrying, turning it over at the edge of sleep, finding it waiting in the odd hours of the afternoon when the thinking is least controlled and most honest. What he produced in those constrained conditions was the story of a man who believed he could divide himself. Henry Jekyll had arrived at the conviction that the self was not one thing but two, a moral and respectable part, and something darker and less constrained, and that if only the two could be separated cleanly enough, the respectable part could live in perfect safety, free from the disturbance of its companion, while the companion pursued its own inclinations without staining the reputation of the whole. It was an appealing arrangement to consider, the fantasy of surgical self-division, keeping the presentable self intact while releasing, in controlled conditions, the part that cannot be permitted in public. The philosophy it expressed was not merely a dramatic device. It was a description of something real, the hope that the shadow can be managed by containment rather than confronted by integration. What the story demonstrates, with the particular force of narrative rather than argument, is what that arrangement produces. Hyde did not remain small and manageable. He grew. The more that Jekyll used the division, the more that Hyde expanded, as though the energy that had been held in check by the full architecture of a whole person was now concentrated in the released part, accumulating force in the way that a river forced through a narrow channel gathers speed and pressure. Hyde became not just difficult, but ungovernable, not just dark, but overwhelming. And the lesson the story offers, though Stevenson was a novelist rather than a philosopher, and was working in image rather than argument, is the lesson that later psychological thought would confirm in its own vocabulary. What is fully excluded does not dissolve, it consolidates. It waits for the conditions in which it can return, and when the return comes, it is stronger for the waiting. Jung would have recognized what Stevenson had found. He would have read the story and seen in it a dramatization of the principle he was still working toward in his own practice, that the shadow not acknowledged from the inside does not simply cease to operate. It operates from the outside, arriving through the back door of dreams and symptoms and the inexplicable hostility of one's reactions to people who have done nothing beyond possessing some quality one cannot allow oneself. The integration of the shadow, in Jung's understanding, was not a project of making peace with one's wickedness. It was something more structural than that, the recognition that a self which has expelled its own contents is not safer for the expulsion, but more unstable. That wholeness requires the inhabited relationship with all of what is one's own, including the portions that socialization has condemned as unsuitable. Stevenson could not have known he was writing this argument. He was, perhaps, living it in that constrained Bournemouth room, finding in the narrative form what he could not have articulated directly. There is, in the Western philosophical tradition, a persistent impulse to resolve the question of inner duality by declaring a winner, to say that reason must govern appetite, or that the shadow must be brought under the control of the ego, or that the dark side of human nature must be conquered rather than inhabited. The impulse is comprehensible. It emerges from the genuine recognition that some of what resides in the shadow is genuinely harmful, that not everything suppressed has been suppressed unjustly, and that the project of integration is not the same as the project of permission. But there is another tradition, older than Western philosophy in its current form, that holds the question differently, that does not reach for the language of conquest at all, because its fundamental image of reality is not a battlefield but a circle. In Taoist philosophy, a brush moves across paper and draws a circle, dividing it into dark and light with a single curving line. This is an image many people carry without necessarily knowing where it comes from or how much it was designed to hold. The design is precise. The dark portion contains a small circle of light. The light portion contains a small circle of dark. The line between them is not straight. It flows, curves, completes itself in a shape that suggests movement rather than fixed partition. And the circle as a whole is not the victory of one side over the other. It is the form that both sides make together, the form that neither can make alone. The philosophical position this image carries is not merely an aesthetic preference for harmony. It is a claim about the nature of reality, including the reality of the inner life. In the Taoist view, what appears to be opposition is more accurately understood as complementarity. The dark does not oppose the light. It defines the light, makes it visible, gives it its shape, provides the contrast without which lightness would have no meaning. And the light does not conquer the dark. It inhabits it, is bounded by it, draws its own existence from the fact of the dark's presence. The yin-yang is not a diagram of struggle. It is a diagram of mutual constitution. For the shadow, this carries a specific implication that the Western tradition has been slower to articulate. The darkness in the self is not something external to the self that has infiltrated what would otherwise be pure light. It is part of what the self is, constitutively, in the same way that night is not an absence of day that arrived from outside, but the daily completion of the same rotating world. What the Taoist tradition offers is not a technique for integrating the shadow, but something more fundamental, a reimagining of what the self is in the first place. If the self is not a defended light that has been invaded by darkness, but a rotating whole in which both are always present and always passing into each other, then the question changes. It is no longer how to conquer the dark, or even how to make peace with it. It becomes more quietly how to move with the rotation rather than against it. This is a different quality of relationship to inner complexity than the one Plato was proposing at his writing table in the early Athens morning. It does not set the parts of the soul against each other in a hierarchy where reason must prevail. It does not ask which aspect of the inner life has the legitimate claim to authority. It asks, instead, something more patient. What is the natural movement of this whole thing, and is there a way to inhabit it without requiring any part of it to disappear? The question, held at this distance, is not alarming. It is quieting. It suggests that the inner life does not need to be resolved, only lived in a way that allows for the full rotation, the light moving through its arc and the dark moving through its own, each giving way to the other in a rhythm that has been completing itself for longer than any particular self has existed to observe it. Immanuel Kant spent most of his adult life in Königsberg, a city he almost never left, and from that singular fixed location conducted an investigation into the nature of reason that ranged across the full territory of what human minds could and could not know. He was known for his regularity. His walks were so punctual that neighbors were said to set their clocks by them, and for the enormous intellectual ambition that his regular habits quietly contained. He had solved, to his own satisfaction, the question of what morality required, the categorical imperative, the principle that one should act only according to a maxim one could will to be a universal law. The architecture of his moral philosophy was formal, rigorous, and magnificent. And then, later in his career, he returned to a problem that the architecture did not resolve. The problem was this: why, if the moral law is written in the structure of practical reason itself, why, if every rational being can in principle recognize what morality demands, do rational beings so consistently fail to follow it? The failure was not, Kant thought, the result of simple ignorance. The people who acted badly generally knew, at some level, what the right action would have been. The failure was something older and more persistent than ignorance, something that operated not alongside reason, but within it, a tendency to prefer the version of a maxim that happened to serve one's own interests, to construct with genuine intellectual facility a rationale for the self-serving choice that could be made to look, from the appropriate angle, like a universal principle. He called this the radical propensity to evil, and in calling it radical, he meant something specific. It was not a surface feature, not a correctable habit, not a failure of sufficient education. It reached all the way down into the structure of the will itself. This is a discomforting thing for a philosopher of reason to acknowledge. Kant had built the most systematic architecture of moral philosophy in the Western tradition, had established the rational grounds for moral obligation with a rigor that no one before him had achieved. And then he sat with the recognition that the very instrument of moral reasoning was subject to a persistent gravitational pull in the direction of the self. Reason could be used to rationalize. The faculty that was supposed to hold the moral law in view could be quietly tilted, slightly and nearly invisibly, by interest, so that what looked like a universal principle, on examination, was the local interest dressed in the borrowed clothes of universality. The shadow, in Kant's account, does not live in the unconscious. It lives in the structure of the moral will itself. It is the small, persistent dishonesty that rational creatures bring to the question of their own obligations, the tendency to find, with great intellectual fluency, reasons why this particular case is different, why what would obviously be wrong in the abstract is in the concrete reality of one's own situation something considerably more complicated. Kant did not present this as a reason to abandon the moral law or to discard the ambition of virtue. He was not Nietzsche. He was not arguing that the aspiration toward goodness was itself a form of self-deception. He was arguing that the aspiration and the execution are separated by something real and persistent, a friction in the machinery of the moral self that no amount of theoretical clarity fully removes. The philosopher who has understood the categorical imperative is not, for that reason, immune to the radical propensity. The understanding and the living are not the same, and the gap between them is not a gap that knowledge alone can close. It requires something else, a quality of ongoing attention, a willingness to observe the self in its actual movements, rather than in its self-reported intentions, a practice of looking honestly at what is happening, rather than what one would prefer to believe is happening. This is a point of convergence between the most systematic of Western moral philosophers and the most psychological of Western thinkers. Kant approaching the shadow from the direction of moral philosophy, and Jung approaching it from the direction of depth psychology, arrive in the same territory by different paths. Both find that the inner life is not transparent to the person who inhabits it. Both find that what a person believes about their own motivations is not a reliable account of what is actually driving their behavior. Both find that something operates in the self that is not fully available to the light of conscious attention, whether that something is called the radical propensity to evil or the shadow. The name is less important than the recognition it is pointing at. The self is not what it appears to be to itself. The work of living honestly requires a different quality of attention than ordinary self-reporting provides. There is in this recognition something that might seem, at first encounter, like a melancholy conclusion. The self that believes it is transparent to itself is mistaken. The philosopher who believes their virtue is secure is less secure than they think. The person who is confident in their own goodness should, perhaps, be less confident, not because goodness is impossible, but because the confidence itself may be a symptom of insufficient looking. But this is not where the recognition comes to rest, in the tradition that has held it longest. The philosophers who sat with the knowledge of inner complexity, Plato with his tripartite soul, Nietzsche with his insistence on what suppression costs, Kant with his radical propensity, were not undone by what they found. They were deepened by it. The acknowledgement of inner division does not make the aspiration to virtue pointless. It makes it serious. It removes the innocence that does not know how much it is up against and replaces it with the more durable, more practiced, more honest aspiration of someone who has looked at the full picture and chosen to keep going. The Taoist brush completes its circle. Dark into light, light into dark, the boundary between them curving rather than straight. Plato's tripartite soul continues its ongoing negotiation, the reason still setting directions, the appetite still pulling, the spirit still providing what force it can for the long effort of arrangement. Nietzsche returns from his mountain path with something written in his notebook that will require several more mornings of walking to fully know. Kant sits at his desk in Königsberg in the late afternoon, having walked on schedule and now returned to the problem that the schedule did not solve, the problem of how a being capable of reasoning about the good nonetheless manages to pull consistently, almost invisibly, in the direction of the self. Stevenson sleeps in Bournemouth after a difficult night, the story having come to the page in a form he did not entirely plan, carrying something true about division and what it produces when it is held too long. These figures, separated by centuries and by the entirely different shapes their lives took, are in some sense sitting with the same recognition, approached from different angles and held in different vocabularies. The inner life is not unified. It contains parts that do not share the same aspirations, forces that do not resolve into a single coherent direction, material that does not surface easily into the light of ordinary self-knowledge. This is not a problem that any of them solved. It is a problem they inhabited, which may be, in the end, the only way a problem of this kind can honestly be handled, not solved, but lived in, not resolved, but moved through, with the particular patience of someone who has decided that the difficulty is not a reason to look away. The question of inner duality is not a question that belongs to any single century or culture. It has been asked in Athens, and in the Chinese philosophical tradition, and in Königsberg, and in the mountain paths above Swiss villages, and in rooms where illness makes the imagination press into shapes it would not otherwise have found. It will be here, in some form, tomorrow. It is here in the particular quality of the dark room at this hour of the night, when the ordinary arrangements of the day have relaxed and something quieter and less managed is briefly present in the space they leave behind. The question does not demand an answer tonight. It does not demand an answer on any particular night. It waits with the patience that old questions eventually develop, not impatiently, not urgently, but with the steady, unhurried quality of something that knows it has time. The yin-yang circle turns in the slow dark. Neither the light nor the dark wins, neither completes its arc and disappears. They continue in their reciprocal movement, each giving way and returning, each containing the small seed of the other, the whole form describing not a struggle, but a rhythm, old steady, requiring nothing of anyone, simply continuing in the way that deep things continue, beneath the surface of what any one life can fully see, or know, or name. Robert Johnson was at his desk in the early 1980s, writing by hand on a fresh page, when he set down a phrase that had been forming in him across years of analytical work. The phrase was simple. It contained only 4 words. Owning your own shadow. He looked at it for a moment, the way a person looks at something that has arrived in a slightly different form than expected. Not wrong, but more precise than anticipated. The word owning was the one that mattered. Not confronting, not defeating, not even understanding. Exactly. Owning the way one owns a coat long worn, a room long inhabited, a history that belongs to no one else. Johnson had spent many years sitting with people in the contained quiet of the consulting room, listening to what arrived when the ordinary defenses were gently set aside. What he found, again and again, was not the monster the person had feared encountering. What he found was more like a stranger who had been walking one step behind for the whole of a life, never introduced, never acknowledged, carrying something the conscious self had long ago decided it could not hold. The shadow, in Johnson's understanding, was not only the dark, it held the golden too, the rejected gifts, the unlived ambitions, the creative impulses judged too large, or too strange, or too much, folded away into that interior room so early that their original warmth had been nearly forgotten. The word for this, in the longer Jungian tradition, is the golden shadow. It describes something specific and somewhat surprising. When qualities in another person provoke an intensity of admiration disproportionate to ordinary appreciation. When a stranger's effortless confidence, or a musician's ease with expression, or a writer's capacity for tenderness in prose produces something closer to ache than appreciation. What is being glimpsed is not simply the other person's gift. It is the reflection of a capacity the admirer already carries, quietly waiting in the interior dark to be recognized as one's own. The beauty one worships in others tends to be borrowed back from the self. The worship is a form of recognition aimed in the wrong direction. Johnson understood this not as a theoretical construct, but as something he had watched happen in the actual, unhurried work of sitting with another person over time. The moment of recognition, when it came, had a particular quality. It was not dramatic. It arrived more like a slow thaw than a sudden light. The person would say something carefully, with some hesitation, and then pause, and in the pause, something loosened. Something that had been held at a fixed distance for a long time was allowed briefly to move closer. This is what Johnson meant by owning. Not a single decisive act, but an ongoing, patient practice of drawing nearer to what has been kept away. James Hollis, who worked within the same Jungian tradition, came at the same territory from a slightly different angle. He was interested in what he called the unlived life. That sense, familiar to many people in the middle of their years, that something essential has not been attended to. Not a specific regret, exactly, though it could wear that shape. More like a persistent low hum beneath the ordinary arrangements of a life, suggesting that something was present and wanting and not being heard. Hollis framed this not as a symptom to be corrected, but as a form of intelligence. The psyche sending a signal. The question the signal was carrying, underneath its restless or melancholy surface, was something like, what does the unlived life want from me now? Not an accusation, a genuine question, patient and waiting. The shadow in this reading is not only what is morally complicated in a person, not only the anger that was told it was shameful and folded quietly downward, not only the hunger that was called inappropriate and stored in the interior room, it is also the poet who was told to be practical, the philosopher who was told to be useful, the person who loved a particular quality of silence and was told in 100 small ways that this love was an indulgence, all of it stored carefully and without resentment, waiting for the right quality of attention. Hollis trusted the signal. He trusted that what the restlessness and the ache were pointing at was real, and that following them carefully, without urgency, was not self-indulgence, but the beginning of something more honest than what had been managed without them. Walt Whitman understood something similar, though he arrived at it through a different path entirely. In his writing room in Camden, New Jersey, Late in his life, surrounded by the loose pages of various editions of the same book, endlessly revised and extended, he would sometimes read aloud to himself, not to hear how the lines sounded to an audience, but to hear how they sounded in the room of his own body, as though checking whether they were still true. The line he returned to most was one he had written decades earlier and never taken back. "I contain multitudes." He said it in different registers over the years, sometimes as an announcement, expansive and unafraid, sometimes as a quieter thing, more like a description of what he had simply noticed, that the self, at close examination, was not the single unified thing conventional moral tidiness required it to be. It was large, it held contradictions, without needing to resolve them. It was both the ordinary man walking by the river at dusk and the something else that watched the ordinary man and found him, in his very ordinariness worthy of song. This was not a philosophical position Whitman argued for in abstract terms. It was something he demonstrated, sentence by sentence, across the long, strange book of his life's work. The coarse and the refined, the tender and the raucous, the mortal body in all its particularity, and the enormous impersonal force the body briefly housed. He did not ask these to sort themselves into acceptable and unacceptable. He asked only that they be named honestly and held together in the same large, undefended space. The self that contained multitudes was not a self in crisis. It was a self at rest, the only rest that was genuine, the rest that comes from not needing to exile any part of the picture in order to call the whole thing good. The deepest philosophical grounding for this kind of self-inquiry, the patient, unhurried examination of the interior, was stated most plainly by Socrates, some 2,500 years before Johnson set his phrase down on a fresh page. Socrates had been in the agora that morning, as he was most mornings, finding a person confident in their own understanding, and asking, with genuine curiosity and no performance of cleverness, whether that understanding could bear a second look. The method made him beloved by young men who enjoyed watching certainty carefully disassembled, and made him a source of considerable irritation to those whose certainty was being examined. He was not performing, he was not arguing for a position. He was genuinely following the thread of any question that arose, willing to see where it led, without deciding in advance that the destination would be comfortable. By the time of his trial, in 399 BCE, Socrates was in his 70s. He had spent most of his adult life conducting this examination, not as a private meditation retreated into, but as a dialogical practice carried on in the actual, noisy, contentious world of Athenian public life. What he concluded, if it could be called a conclusion, was modest and vast at the same time. He did not know very much. This was not false humility. It was the thing the examination had genuinely revealed. Every confident position, when followed carefully enough, arrived at an edge, a place where the certainty thinned, and something more uncertain opened beyond it. The unexamined life, he told the court that would condemn him, was not worth living. Not because the examined life was comfortable or because it led to satisfying answers, but because the alternative, the life lived inside unchecked assumptions, confident of what the self is and is not, certain of which parts are admissible, that life never quite becomes one's own. It remains borrowed from whoever did the sorting. First, the examined life, in Socrates' understanding, was not a finished project. It was a practice, ongoing, daily, conducted not in solitude alone, but in the genuine company of other minds, willing to follow a thought further than comfort usually permits. He understood that this company was necessary. that the mind turned only on itself tends toward repetition, toward the careful avoidance of the edges it has already located and found uncomfortable. The dialogue, the actual exchange with another person who brings a different starting place, was what kept the examination honest, what kept it moving, what prevented it from becoming, over time, simply a more sophisticated performance of the certainties it was nominally questioning. Johnson's consulting room was in this sense continuous with Socrates' agora, different in form, the same in spirit, a space where assumptions could be brought into the open without urgency, without the pressure to arrive at a particular outcome, with only the patient willingness to see what was actually there, rather than what had long been decided was there. The tradition that Socrates inaugurated, the tradition of honest self-examination conducted without predetermined outcome, has always known that the self doing the examining is not a simple or transparent thing. What Plato called the tripartite soul, what Kant described as the persistent human tendency to rationalize in the direction of self-interest, even while performing virtue, what Freud located in the mechanisms of repression and return, all of these were observations of the same basic fact. The self-examining itself is also the self that has arranged over many years not to see certain things. The examination, if it is genuine, eventually reaches the arrangements. It reaches the places where the light was redirected long ago, and the rooms that were closed and labeled and left. What happens when the examination reaches those rooms is not, in most cases, a dramatic revelation. It is not the lighting of a torch in a dungeon. It is something slower and more ordinary, a quality of attention brought to something that has simply been waited a long time for this quality of attention. The interior room in the image Johnson returned to was not a place of confinement. The things stored there were not imprisoned. They were held, carefully and without judgment, by whatever in the psyche had understood, from the beginning, that they could not yet be carried in the open, and had been keeping them safe until something in the outer life was ready to receive them. Active imagination was Jung's method for approaching this material, the technique Johnson described and worked with throughout his career. It was not quite meditation, not quite dream interpretation, not quite dialogue in the ordinary sense. It was the willingness to close the ordinary busy management of the day's concerns and allow the figures of the interior to approach in something like their own form, and then to speak with them, not to instruct or to argue, but to listen, with the kind of genuine receptivity that is usually reserved for another person in the room. The shadow figure, when approached this way, rarely arrived as threatening. It arrived more often as tired, as something that had been carrying a portion of the self's history for a long time without being thanked, without being seen, without being asked what it knew. What it knew, in many cases, was something the conscious self had needed to put down in order to function. The anger that had been told it was shameful, the grief that had been told it was weakness, the ambition that had been told it was grandiosity, the longing for beauty that had been told it was impractical, stored, all of it, in the interior room, on the carefully arranged shelves, not lost, but waiting. And when the quality of attention finally arrived, unhurried, without agenda, without the need to fix or to resolve, what these figures offered back was not disruption. It was more like a restoration of something the life had been subtly incomplete without. Johnson wrote that the shadow contained the unlived life, and the unlived life was not a reproach. It was a resource, a depth, the part of the self that had not yet been brought into the fullness of the ordinary day, but that had been present all along, contributing its weight and its color to everything the conscious self had done, often without the conscious self knowing what was being contributed, or from where it came. The inexplicable affinity for certain landscapes, the persistent sense in some conversations of having something important to say that would not quite form into words. The way certain music arrived, not merely as sound, but as something older, something recognized from a place that was not quite memory and not quite imagination. All of this, in the longer view, traceable to the unlived depth. The material that had been stored and was waiting. Robert A. Johnson came to believe, across a long career of careful analytical work, that the integration of shadow material, the slow, patient process of acknowledging what had been disowned and drawing it back into relationship with the conscious life, was not finally a therapeutic task. It was a spiritual one, not in any narrowly religious sense, in the sense that something was being recovered which was essential to the wholeness of the person, not something foreign, not something corrected or improved from outside, something original, something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the life to become spacious enough to hold it. Hollis described the same process as the enlargement of the life, the slow continuing expansion of what a person is capable of inhabiting without fear, not the resolution of difficulty, not the elimination of the shadow, the development of a conscious, ongoing relationship with it, in which the dark and the golden are both acknowledged as belonging, both allowed their portion of the space, both understood as part of the full account. The life enlarged in this way was not a more comfortable life necessarily. It was a more complete one. The difference between completeness and comfort is one of the things the shadow has been quietly insisting on from its patient interior room for as long as it has been kept there. Walt Whitman had arrived at this insistence from the other direction, not through the analytical examination of what was stored in the interior, but through the expansive democratic embrace of everything that presented itself to observation, including the parts of the self the orderly social world would prefer not to name. His poem was, among many other things, a refusal of the editing process, the process by which the self, in order to be acceptable, learns to present only the portions that have been adjudicated presentable. Whitman looked at this process and declined, not out of defiance exactly, though there was some of that, out of something more like fidelity, the insistence that the full self, including its coarseness and its contradictions and its refusal to resolve neatly into a single coherent position, was the only self worth writing from, and by implication, the only self worth living from. The line containing multitudes was not written as a declaration of abundance in the ordinary sense. It was written as a kind of permission, a statement that the tidy unified self of conventional moral philosophy, the self that knows exactly what it is and is not, that has sorted its contents into the acceptable and the inadmissible and lives accordingly, was not the only possible self, was not even perhaps the truest one. The self that contained multitudes was larger than the self that had made itself legible. It was less convenient. It required more from the people who tried to be in genuine relationship with it, but it was more honest. And in the Whitmanian understanding, honesty about the self was not primarily a moral virtue. It was a precondition for the kind of aliveness that made a life worth the name. Socrates would have recognized this, though he would have approached it differently. He would have begun asking questions. What exactly is the self that contains multitudes? Are all of the multitudes equally to be affirmed? Is there no standard by which some of the contained material might be examined, and after honest examination, consciously chosen against? He would not have asked these questions to undermine the multitudes. He would have asked because for Socrates, the examined life was the prerequisite for everything, including the authentic self-acceptance Whitman was reaching toward. The examination was not the opposite of acceptance. It was the path to the kind of acceptance that was not simply permissiveness, but genuine understanding. The understanding of a person who has looked honestly at the full range of what they carry and has found it in the looking livable. Jung's own understanding of individuation, the long, lifelong process of becoming more fully oneself, was built on precisely this recognition that the goal was not to eliminate the shadow, not to conquer the dark, not to achieve a final purity of character in which all that was difficult or contradictory or ungovernable had been successfully suppressed. The goal was the development of a relationship, a conscious, ongoing relationship between the ego and the shadow, in which the shadow's material was not denied or exiled, but brought into dialogue, acknowledged, and in time integrated into a more complete sense of what the self actually was. Individuation in this understanding was never finished. There was no point of arrival. The process continued and deepened, and the self that emerged from it was not a tidier or simpler self, but a larger one, capable of holding more, capable of inhabiting its own history without needing to revise the parts that were uncomfortable, capable of meeting the darkness in itself and others with something closer to equanimity than fear, not because the darkness was no longer there, because the relationship with it had changed. The shadow walked alongside, known, carrying its portion of the self's full history, and the walking forward together on whatever path opened next was what individuation actually felt like from the inside. Johnson understood this with particular clarity because he had seen it, not in the abstract, but in the particular, lived experience of the people who had done this work across years of careful attention. And the person who had owned the shadow was not more composed or more serene in any performed sense. They were simply more present, more fully themselves. The energy that had gone into keeping the shadow at a distance, maintaining the interior arrangements, redirecting the light, keeping the stored room locked and unlabeled, that energy became available for other things, for the actual living of the life, for the relationships that required being genuinely seen, for the work that required access to the full depth, including the depths that had been stored on the patient shelves in the interior room. There is a quality of attention that makes this possible. It is not urgency. Urgency, in the interior life as in most things, tends to close what it wants to open. The quality of attention that allows shadow material to move toward the light is more like the attention one brings to a long-standing question that has been resting quietly in the mind and is now, without pressure, ready to be returned to, patient, unhurried, without a predetermined sense of what should be found. The quality of attention that sits with something as it is, rather than as it would be convenient for it to be. This is the quality that Jung called analytical, that Socrates called philosophical, that Whitman demonstrated, line by line, across the enormous, tender, contradictory span of his single long poem. James Hollis wrote that the soul, the deep interior life, was always asking for more life, not necessarily more comfort, not necessarily more success in the terms the world provided. More life in the sense of greater depth of experience, greater honesty of feeling, greater fidelity to what the person actually was, as distinct from what they had agreed long ago in a world of small permissions and smaller prohibitions to appear to be. The shadow was the storehouse of that more life. Not all of it morally complex, not all of it requiring difficult reckoning, much of it simply the fullness that had been deferred, the gifts not claimed, the longings not followed, the parts of the self that had waited, without impatience for the outer life to become spacious enough to receive them. The receiving did not need to be dramatic, it rarely was. It happened in the ordinary texture of a life that had begun to pay a different quality of attention, in the moment of waking in the night and staying, briefly, with the interior rather than reaching immediately for distraction, in the conversation that moved without planning to into something more honest than the conversation that had been expected, in the recognition arrived at slowly and without announcement that the quality one had most admired in someone else was something one had been carrying all along, and that the admiration had been, beneath its apparent outward direction, a form of private recognition. Whitman, in his old age, reading his own lines back to himself in the room in Camden, understood this. The poem had been a form of shadow work, though he would not have used the term. It had been the ongoing refusal to exile any portion of the self from the written record, the coarse alongside the refined, the mortal alongside the cosmic, the ordinary afternoon walk alongside the vision that turned the ordinary afternoon walk into something else entirely, into evidence of something so large and patient that the only honest response to it was a kind of steady, unhurried gratitude. He contained multitudes, and he had spent his life giving each of them their line. Johnson's phrase, owning your own shadow, contained within it the same understanding that the shadow was not separate from the self, that it had never been separate, that the distance between the conscious ego and the accumulated interior material was always a maintained distance, created by intention and sustained by effort, and that when the effort was gently, consciously released, what remained was not chaos, but something closer to wholeness, the self, finally, in something like its full dimensionality, not tidied, not simplified, not reduced to the portions that were legible and acceptable, the full thing, with its contradictions intact and its history honestly held. The self that owns its shadow is not a more comfortable self. It is a more complete one. The difference is significant. Comfort tends toward the arrangements that have been established, the light directed away from certain rooms, the contents of those rooms left undisturbed. Completeness tends toward the honest inventory, not because honesty is painless, but because the alternative, the life conducted entirely within the portion that has been adjudicated presentable, is a life lived at permanent reduced scale, the capacity for connection reduced, the capacity for creative depth reduced, the capacity for genuine encounter with another person reduced, because genuine encounter requires the willingness to be seen in something closer to the full account. Socrates understood this as a matter of philosophical necessity. Johnson understood it as a matter of psychological health. Whitman understood it as a matter of poetic fidelity. All three, arriving from different directions, arrived at the same open country, the country in which the self that has been examined honestly, that has looked at its own stored rooms with the patient lamp of genuine attention, discovers that what was stored there was not, in the end, so different from what had been kept in the light, that the division itself was the problem, not the material on either side of it. In the early morning light, the particular quality of light that arrives before the day has established its requirements. A person carries two figures, the one that is known, that moves through the familiar arrangements of the life with practiced ease, that knows its lines and its limits and the rooms it is permitted to enter, and the one that has been carried, the shadow companion, the accumulation of what the known self has not claimed, patient and present and never once actually absent. These two figures have been moving together for the whole of a life. In the long years of the distance between them, each has shaped the other in ways that cannot be fully mapped. The known self has been colored by the disowned. The disowned has taken its shape from what the known self most needed to put away. When the distance begins to close, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the slow, patient way that actual things change, what arrives is something that has no adequate name in the ordinary vocabulary. Not happiness exactly, not resolution, something quieter. The quality of a life that has stopped working against itself in a particular way. The quality of a self that has, for perhaps the first time, met its own shadow in something like daylight and found it, not monstrous, not overwhelming, not the thing it feared, but simply the rest of itself, the part that was always there and has been waiting with the patience of everything that has nowhere else to go, to be welcomed home.